Hey everybody, it's Professor Parish. How are you guys doing? This is our last chapter on poetry. So, I hope that midterms were good to all of you and that you guys did great with them. As I've said in the past couple of videos, we don't really have a midterm exam in here. I do take midterm grades and send them in based on the end of week 8. So that would include your grammar checkup and reading response number 3. So as always, if you have questions, just let me know. I am going to go through the last couple of chapters of poetry. I've talked to a couple students and they have noted that, yeah, these videos are long. I know that not all of you maybe have time to slog through everything and sit down and directly watch this. I would encourage you, if you get this on your phone, pull up this video on YouTube, set it in your phone, listen to it on your car drive to work, or listen to it on your drive to class, or if you get a chance, usually at the front part of the videos I will go over housekeeping things, and then in the latter or rest of the video I'll go over the actual terminology and chapters. So you can kind of break it up that way. I would definitely each week watch the first part of the video, at least to make sure I'm not talking about the paper that we're doing or about anything important with the class. And then, obviously I want you guys to watch the rest of these videos because, one, I'm giving you information that's going to be on your tests, but also as we go through it, I'm talking about the paper and I am talking about how you can use some of these terms within your actual assignments. So I would encourage you to watch them. If you are stressed for time, then try to listen to them as you commute. Try to listen to them as you're taking the exams and see if they're helpful. But our exams, you all should get 100% on them because not only are the answers in the books, but I also go over them in these videos and I kind of drop some hints as the videos go along. So you all should be making A's on the exam. If you're not, then I'm questioning, one, if you have the book. You should by now. We're at midterm. But also whether you're using those materials or you're using these videos as resources. I mean, they're there to help you. So without further ado, we are going to finish up poetry. I hope that you all at least, I know that I'm not going to convert everybody into somebody that likes poetry, but I hope that at least by the end of this unit, you at least understand it a little bit better and have gained some appreciation for the genre itself. Right? So, persona is chapter 19. And we've talked about persona with prose. I really like this creepy picture of this woman with this sculpture over her face, and it kind of looks like a mask, because that's exactly what persona is in prose. Persona that we've talked about in prose and fiction and nonfiction is sort of a mask or an identity that you take on that is not really you. Persona is a little bit different in poetry. With poetry, persona is actually the voice that you have, your actual narration or voice or purpose that you carry within the poem. So it's kind of like mixing point of view with style a little bit in terms of poetry. So on page 853, we're going to kind of skim through here. We have the style of confessional. We've talked about confessional in our prose unit, and that's really just, in prose, it's confessional. It's like a diary. For poetry, it's almost secretive, like it's spoken in whispers or behind closed doors. It's not supposed to be taken as something that's boasted or literal. And the best example I really love is Sappho. If you don't know who Sappho is, I hope that if you're an English major or an education major, you get to take a rhetoric class in the future. And you'll learn about all the Greek rhetoricians like Aristotle and Socrates. We know about them just through word of mouth, but they're the kinds of philosophers that create up a lot of ideals that we still practice in society today. And Sappho is probably one of the most interesting figures that I remember my class studying in college for rhetoric, and she was actually the female Greek rhetorician, the only one documented at the time. There are rumors that Sappho is just a pen name of Socrates, that he's just pinning himself as a woman. I don't believe that at all. Based on Sappho or Sappho, however you want to say it, Sappho's work, she basically is a student of Socrates. And before you question it, no, she is not interested at all in Socrates. Quite the opposite. She does a lot of poetry that is romantic, but and very erotic for Greek times. It's very suggestive poetry, and I would recommend you go check it out because it's interesting. But especially for it being written down and shared at that time period. But Sappho is the only female Greek rhetorician that we really have any information or documents on, and she did a lot of poetry. And on page 853, there is a poem, a letter to Anactoria, and it kind of describes how someone could be so breathtaking and beautiful that it literally kills you. And it's an interesting poem. I like it. And so, yeah, 2,500-year-old poem that basically says the same thing we're saying now. The times, they have not changed in some ways. But her poem's very confessional because it's almost like a whisper, like a secret. She doesn't really want to tell the world about this love. She's just kind of like, you know, letting it out, like, oh, hey, by the way, let me tell you about this. And that's kind of what her poem is. It's very intimate and very close. It's not like grand and sweeping like a ballad. It's a very intimate, quiet poem, and that's what confessional is. The persona of a poem can do a number of things. They can share real-life experiences. So through persona, we can share how we felt during a certain event. So you could write a poem about a tornado, or you could write a poem about a family member dying, and that's your way of sharing your voice through that persona in the poem. It can present an edited or guarded version of the subject. So like Sappho's poem here on page 853, there's parts of it that are not spelled out for us, the reader, and we kind of have to interpret what she's trying to say. And that's kind of an edited version. It's not direct. It's just very, you know, put together in a way that's vague enough we can kind of give our own meaning to what we think she's saying. It can adopt the stance of the detached observer, meaning that you're watching something happen, but you're not really a part of it. It would be as if you were, if two people collided into each other on bicycles across the street. You're not close enough where you can really do anything, but you're close enough where you can watch it happen. That's detached observer, where you're not actually close enough or intimate enough to do anything about the situation, but you still can see it happen and describe it. And then maybe an imaginary character, very different from the poem. So Dr. Seuss, I would look to him in terms of persona, because oftentimes Dr. Seuss will have an imaginary character be the narrator or the persona of his poem that's not even a part of the poem itself. They're just the voice talking about it. Or maybe they are a character that was once part of the poem but are now removed. So you can think of the Lorax in terms of that. So that is persona. It's basically just the voice of the poem and who's talking about it. And that's something to consider because, you know, with fiction, the narrator is pretty easy to spot. By the first couple of chapters, you know who's talking in the story. In Game of Thrones, the narrator's name is on the front chapter right before you start reading. So it's pretty easy to pick out a narrator in fiction or prose, but with poetry it's a little more difficult. So being able to identify persona and say, okay, who's telling this poem? Does it have a narrator? Who is the narrator? From whose perspective is this poem happening from? It can make it easier to understand the poem if you have that knowledge going in. Chapter 20, Tone, the language of emotions. Tone and mood are very similar. The chapter of tone, I'm just going to jump around here, starts on page 872. Right there. And I do like this picture of these people on this page because there's a lot going on here. You have a woman who has the ultimate resting face, just having none of it. And then you have a woman who's clearly happy, a man who looks a bit disturbed, deranged, unsure, anxious, and then a man with his hand over his chest like he's being patriotic. Or so I'm not sure you know, we're not sure what's going on in this photo, but there's a lot of emotions and tones ranging throughout it. And poetry can range in tone wildly. So, tone is the attitude that's created through words in the poem. There's a lot of terms that go along with this. The first one we encounter on page 880 is understatement. We talked a little bit about understatement with prose, and that is the idea of a poet downplaying how important or impactful an emotion is. So on page 880 we have Dylan Thomas's "Do not go gentle into that good night," which is an analogy or an allusion to don't just quietly die, basically. So you can read through this poem here. He sets up a lot of parallelisms. He sets up a lot of kind of similar words. I'm not going to read the entire poem. I'll let you do that. But I do like the last two verses here. There's 6 verses total, so the last two. Grave men near death who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay, rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. So it's a lot of like emotional items there at work, but I like do not go gentle into that good night is an understatement in itself, because it's basically saying, you know, don't just quietly go along and accept your fate, you know, fight on and carry on and keep working towards your goal. Don't just stop and give up. So there's a lot of understatement in this poetry. Their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Good men the last way by, crying how bright. So, you know, basically people looking back on what might have been and, you know, not moving forward. So it's almost like, it's not like circumlocution where we're avoiding saying what needs to be said, but understatement is you're just downplaying it a lot and making it seem like it's not a big deal when it actually is. So, other terms that are on the next page there, elegies. Elegies are just poems of mourning. So, if an obituary was a poem, that would be an elegy. Or if you're grieving, people write poetry as therapy, that's therapeutic. So anything that is just giving mourning kind of a poetic feel or atmosphere to it would be an elegy. A parable, we have actually probably heard about parables in high school or other classes. That word is thrown out around quite a bit, but a parable is basically just a story with a heavy meaning. So parables are about the closest that poetry will get to becoming actual fiction. And you will notice in this chapter especially, and in the Myth and Illusion chapter when we get to it, that Icarus is a big central focus for these authors. If you don't know who Icarus is, we'll talk a little bit about that in the drama section with one of our examples we'll look at. But Icarus is a Greek folklore. It's about a boy and his father who are inventors, and the boy wants to basically fly to the sun. And so his father creates him a set of wings made of wax, but warns him, you know, don't go too far close to the sun because you'll end up dying. And the boy doesn't believe him. He's too proud. He's like, no, I got this. And so he flies up to the sun. The closer he gets, the hotter it gets. His wax wings melt, and he falls into the ocean and drowns. Greek tales were awesome, right? So many great, wholesome, happy endings, right? But the story of Icarus is popular because it's all about hubris. It's about pride and how the phrase "pride goeth before the fall." You know, his pride, his wings of wax, you know, they melted, and then he fell to his death. So if he had listened to his father and not been, you know, overconfident, over arrogant, and proud, he wouldn't have suffered his fate. So those kind of mythos and lessons are taught over and over again, and in poetry they're called parables. Our book gives another definition of irony on page 883. Again, I think I liked irony the last time that we defined it the best. This one's alright. They define irony here as a wry, humorous effect By bringing out truth we'd prefer to hide. So it's basically not admitting something that you know is true. And then paradox. Paradox is a word that's thrown out quite a bit, especially like in science fiction jargon. They're like, oh, it's this paradox or conundrum. A paradox is just an apparent contradiction that makes sense on second thought. That's how it's defined here. So on page 883 it says, like irony, paradox is aware of the discrepancy between the rest of, and they're using a poem as an example. It makes us try to resolve the issue. But then by trying to answer these questions, we see what the whole point was. So paradox is giving you a mystery and trying to help you solve it, and by solving it, you figure out something deeper or more meaningful in the end. And again, a lot of these terms, they're just stylistic things. They're things you can use if you're analyzing. If you chose options 1 or 3 on your paper, these terms may be something that you can use as an example in your paper to help define those terms. All right, chapter 21 is pretty short. It's just theme, the making of meaning. They basically talk to us about these 3 big themes and terms that go along with it. Abstractions are labels of large areas of human experience. So abstract in this case is not just about thoughts or feelings, things that you can't touch. In this case, it's something very generalized. So an abstraction in poetry could just be about birth or adolescence or death or old age. Something really big and complicated to describe specifically, and that also can be individualized and unique for each person. So poems that use abstractions will take something entirely broad and large and try to, craft a generalized idea out of that poem. These other 2 terms are more specific. Didactic means teaching already accepted ideas or truths, meaning things that we have accepted as true, even if they're not, logically or systemically or spiritually proven otherwise. So something didactic would be teaching, the accepted idea of, rites of passage to adulthood. That could be something a poem could be about. And then a caricature is a comic distortion or exaggeration. So when you go to Holiday World or Disney World and people are drawing the big, self-portraits of people and their eyes are huge, or if they happen to have like a bigger nose than usual, they like over-exaggerate. That's a caricature. And poetry oftentimes can use caricatures. Dr. Seuss, I think, is probably my favorite example of caricatures because they are just exaggerated, over the top, crazy, creative, and weird, and it works. It works for that poem. All right, like I said, these last couple of chapters, there are terms to learn, but most of the chapters are going to be sample poems for you to kind of check out on your own. Chapter 22, though, has our last set of glossy pages, sad face, and talks about myth and illusion. And I really like this weird, if you look on page 933, it's a really weird piece of architecture that almost looks like a face. It's kind of cool. So myth comes from mythos, which is the Greek word for tales. So stories about gods, godlike heroes, and monstrous adversaries. So in Greek and Roman mythology, they had series of gods and goddesses, and most of Greek mythology talks about those gods and goddesses and if they were heroes, what their adventures were, what monsters they fought, etc. There's a ton you can draw from, and there's a lot of poetry based on that as well as fiction and drama. Rituals is on page 933. These are events that are acted out among those heroes and champions. When people redeem themselves, it's like a ritual, a rite of passage. I would think a modern example of this would be Finding Nemo. I have a younger set of cousins, so we watch a lot of Disney, but Nemo's dad is kind of a helicopter parent a little bit, and so when Nemo goes missing, he kind of goes through a ritual where he has to go out on this quest to redeem himself as a father almost by finding Nemo and showing that, and finding out Nemo can take care of himself. And Nemo, subsequently, he also goes through a ritual, literally with the shark bait, hoo-ha-ha, thing they do in the fish tank. But he also finds out that he has to be self-reliant as well. He can't, he has to realize he can be self-reliant, but also realize he has limitations. So there are rituals happening in that film. And I would say you could probably delve into any book or poem that's set up like a parable, for example, and find some kind of ritual or twist or turn in it. And archetypes, we talked about this in prose. These are constant types of characters in stories. Sometimes they're generalized or stereotyped, like the hero, the damsel in distress, the monstrous villain. I think that villainous characters in poems are often archetypes because it's easy to make them archetypes. The mother figure, the father figure, the sibling figure, those all can be fleshed out in different ways in poetry, but I feel like sometimes they fall into archetypes because we are just so used to describing them a certain way. Allusion, our chapter is called Myth and Illusion. An allusion is a callback. It leads into a flashback. So when you allude to something, you are recalling a memory that will trigger a flashback or make it happen. And oftentimes in poetry, an allusion will be a little line or two lines that will happen right before a flashback happens, whether it's a ballad, a parable, or just a poem about a specific moment in time. Your poem could start out being like, I remember when this happened. That would be the allusion. That is our lead-in to our flashback. An ode, if someone said it's an ode to this, it is an elaborate stanza, set of stanzas for solemn subjects. Tomato, tomato, right? But an ode to something is just an elaborate set of verses that talk about something usually very stoic or solemn, almost like a tribute. So if you were writing an ode to my father, it would be a set of verses that's about your father, but done in a very serious, thoughtful, reflective manner, if that makes sense. Odes are not meant to be parodies or farces. They're supposed to be very serious, very solemn, very reflectful, and that's kind of their point. They're not an elegy, so you're not mourning anything, but you are looking at something fondly and recalling its importance through memory in a poem. Metamorphosis, I think most of us know what this is. It's just transformation. And then the glossy pages on page 954 show you these ones I don't like as good as the second set. The second set of glossy images is probably my favorite, but these are pretty good. And you'll notice, starting on page, get to it, around the time you get to the glossy images, there are several poems that talk about Icarus, and our authors like to give us 946. I was trying to find the right page. 946, The Return of Icarus. There's a long ballad there. You can also look at the new Icarus, Landscape with the Fall of Icarus, on pages 948 and 949. And then even The Death of Marilyn Monroe. I include that one in there because The Death of Marilyn Monroe is almost like an Icarus story. So it shows an actress who got so close to the sun, so close to the fame, that it destroyed her. And that one's probably my favorite of all the poems. And I like how they combine that with the story of Icarus. I think it's interesting. So, yeah, that's poetry. Those are our chapters. So this video is a little bit shorter than what's been the last couple of weeks. By this point, you should be getting close to finishing paper 2. I'm really excited to read them. I think paper 2 is probably the most challenging and interesting of the papers because it's so different than the other ones that we'll do in this class, but I'm excited to read them. As always, let me know if you have questions. If any of these terms confuse you or if you're not sure about the meaning, just email or call me, and that should work. All right? I am looking forward to reading your papers, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your week and weekend. Till next time, guys. Bye.